Good evening. Let us look more carefully at what is happening here tonight, because the story you have been told about the rescued pilot is not the story that matters. Yes, a pilot was found alive after his aircraft went down over contested territory. Yes, military officials confirmed his recovery. Yes, the footage shows him being extracted by Special Operations Forces in what appears to be a textbook rescue mission. And yes, the headlines are celebrating this as a triumph of coordination, technology, and courage. But if you think this story ends with one man being brought home safely, you are looking at the wrong part of the chessboard. Tonight, I want to ask you one question that will change how you see everything that follows. When a major military power mobilizes satellite surveillance, deploys special forces across hostile terrain, and risks an international incident to recover a single downed aviator, what message is actually being sent? To whom is that message directed, and what strategic calculation made that risk acceptable? Because the real story here is not about rescue. It is about demonstration, escalation, and the quiet recalibration of deterrence in a region where three nuclear powers now operate under competing rules of engagement. Most people are missing what happened in the 72 hours before that pilot was found. Let me walk you through what the surface narrative wants you to believe, and then show you what the operational reality reveals. The mainstream coverage focuses on the heroism, the technology, the relief. It frames this as a feel-good story about military competence and the principle that no soldier is left behind. That framing is not wrong, but it is catastrophically incomplete. It treats the rescue as the endpoint when in fact the rescue is the opening move in a much larger game. The real question is not how they found him. The real question is what they were willing to risk to demonstrate that they could find him, and what that demonstration signals about the threshold for acceptable military action in zones where sovereignty is disputed and airspace control is ambiguous. Look carefully at the timing. The aircraft went down on March 28th at approximately 1400 hours local time. Within 90 minutes, satellite imagery had been retasked. Within 6 hours, signals intelligence had pinpointed the crash site to within a 5-kilometer radius. Within 18 hours, 3 separate reconnaissance drones were circling the area, and within 48 hours, a cross-border extraction team was on the ground. That is not a rescue operation. That is a strategic demonstration wrapped in a humanitarian mission. Now let me take you deeper into what this event actually reveals about the architecture of modern military deterrence. If this analysis is making you rethink what you thought you understood about how air campaigns operate in contested zones, do me a favor and subscribe for ongoing strategic breakdowns that refuse to accept the surface narrative. Because what we are about to examine is the gap between what military powers say they will do and what operational doctrine requires them to do when an asset goes down in politically sensitive territory. This pilot was flying a reconnaissance mission along a border that 3 different countries claim as their sovereign airspace. The aircraft was not armed for strike operations. It was gathering signals intelligence and mapping ground-based air defense systems. When it went down, it fell into a buffer zone controlled by a proxy militia aligned with a regional power that has spent the last 18 months expanding its influence through exactly these kinds of gray zone territorial assertions. The immediate question was not whether the pilot survived the ejection. The immediate question was whether he could be recovered before he became either a propaganda trophy or a bargaining chip in negotiations that have nothing to do with him. And the calculation that followed was brutal in its clarity. If you leave him, you send a message that your intelligence operations can be disrupted with impunity and that your personnel are expendable when political risk rises. If you go in to get him, you send a message that you will violate airspace, penetrate hostile territory, and accept escalation risk to protect operational credibility. The choice was made in less than 3 hours. Here is where the structural logic becomes unavoidable. Modern aerial reconnaissance in contested regions operates on a principle that most civilians do not understand and that most governments do not publicly acknowledge. The principle is this: every intelligence gathering sortie is simultaneously a test of the adversary's air defense network, a signal of your willingness to operate in disputed zones, and a tripwire for escalation if something goes wrong. When you send an unarmed reconnaissance aircraft into airspace that borders hostile territory, you are not just collecting data. You are forcing the other side to make a decision. Do they track you and file a diplomatic protest? Do they light up their radar and give you free intelligence about their defensive capabilities? Do they scramble interceptors and risk revealing their response time? Or do they take a shot and accept the consequences? In this case, they took a shot. The aircraft was brought down by a surface-to-air missile system supplied by a major power patron but operated by a local proxy force. That combination is critical because it creates plausible deniability while still delivering a strategic message. The message was this: we can impose costs on your reconnaissance operations. We control this airspace in practice, even if you can test it in theory. And we are willing to test how far you will go to assert your operational freedom. The rescue operation was the answer to that test. But here is the part that changes everything. When the Special Forces team crossed into the buffer zone to extract the pilot, they did not go in alone. They were supported by electronic warfare aircraft that jammed local radar, strike fighters that provided overwatch in case ground fire erupted, aerial refueling tankers that extended the operation's range, and satellite communications that linked the extraction team directly to theater command in real time. The total footprint of that rescue involved more than 200 personnel, 9 aircraft, and the coordination of intelligence assets across 4 different military branches. That is an extraordinary commitment of resources for one individual. And that is the point. The operation was designed to be visible, traceable, and undeniable. It was designed to demonstrate that the rescuing power possesses the capability, the will, and the operational freedom to project force across borders when it determines that its strategic interests require it. The pilot was the justification, the demonstration was the objective. Now, let us pull the lens back and look at the historical pattern, because this is not the first time a downed aviator has become the focal point of a much larger strategic confrontation. In May 1960, Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet territory while flying a U-2 reconnaissance mission. The United States initially denied the aircraft was conducting espionage. The Soviet Union paraded Powers in front of cameras and used him as leverage in negotiations that reshaped Cold War diplomacy. The lesson from that event was clear. If you lose a pilot in hostile territory, you lose control of the narrative, you expose your intelligence methods, and you hand your adversary a propaganda weapon that can be used for years. In December 1995, a U.S. Air Force pilot named Scott O'Grady was shot down over Bosnia during a NATO enforcement operation. He evaded capture for 6 days before a Marine extraction team pulled him out. That rescue was used to justify expanding NATO's operational mandate in the Balkans and to demonstrate that Western forces would not be intimidated by Serb air defenses. In both cases, the rescue or capture of the pilot became a proxy for larger questions about operational reach, political will, and the credibility of deterrence. The same pattern is unfolding now. The difference is that in 1960 and 1995, the geopolitical architecture was relatively stable. The rules of engagement were understood even when they were violated. The escalation pathways were mapped. The diplomatic channels were open. Today, none of that is true. We are operating in a multipolar environment where regional powers have access to advanced air defense systems, where proxy forces operate with sophisticated weaponry, where airspace sovereignty is contested in dozens of locations simultaneously, and where the threshold for acceptable military action is being tested in real time. Look at the map and you will see what I mean. This buffer zone where the pilot went down sits at the intersection of 3 strategic spheres of influence. To the north, a major power is consolidating its position through energy infrastructure and security agreements. To the south, a regional bloc is asserting its claim to historical territories and maritime access. To the east, a rising competitor is building a network of ports, airfields, and intelligence sharing arrangements that bypass traditional alliances. And in the center, a collection of smaller states are trying to maintain autonomy while being pulled in multiple directions by competing security guarantees and economic dependencies. When the pilot's aircraft entered that airspace, it was not simply flying a reconnaissance route, it was asserting that one particular power retains the operational freedom to gather intelligence in a zone that all 3 major competitors consider strategically vital. The shoot down was a rejection of that assertion and the rescue was a counter-rejection that said, we will operate here regardless of your objections, we will recover our personnel regardless of your protests, and we will demonstrate our capability regardless of the risk. That is not diplomacy. That is the quiet restructuring of deterrence through demonstrated action. Now let me show you why this matters far beyond one rescue mission. The precedent being set here is that major powers will accept cross-border incursions, airspace violations, and direct confrontation with proxy forces if they determine that operational credibility is at stake. That precedent is being established not through formal doctrine or public declaration, but through the accumulation of actions that push the boundary of acceptable military behavior. Every time a reconnaissance aircraft is shot down and the pilot is recovered through a high-risk extraction, the threshold for escalation moves slightly higher. Every time a special forces team crosses a border without triggering a wider conflict, the definition of what constitutes an act of war becomes slightly more elastic. And every time satellite surveillance and electronic warfare are used to enable operations in contested zones, the distinction between peacetime intelligence gathering and wartime preparation becomes slightly more blurred. We are watching the normalization of military actions that would have been considered unthinkable provocations 2 decades ago. And we are watching it happen not through dramatic announcements or treaty violations, but through the quiet repetition of operations that test the limits of what the other side will tolerate. Here is where the strategic consequences become unavoidable. If you are a regional power watching this rescue unfold, you are drawing 3 conclusions simultaneously. First, your air defense systems can shoot down reconnaissance aircraft, but they cannot prevent the recovery of personnel or the continuation of intelligence operations. Second, your proxy forces can impose tactical costs, but they cannot deter strategic missions or force a withdrawal from contested zones. And third, your attempts to control airspace through surface-to-air missiles and scrambled interceptors are being countered by an operational tempo and technological sophistication that you cannot match without direct military escalation. Those conclusions create a dangerous logic. If you cannot deter reconnaissance through defensive measures, you are incentivized to expand offensive capabilities. If you cannot prevent extractions through proxy forces, you are incentivized to deploy more sophisticated weaponry or direct military presence. And if you cannot control the narrative through captured personnel, you are incentivized to escalate the response to the next incident in ways that make extraction impossible or prohibitively costly. That logic is how limited engagements spiral into regional crises. But now let us move to the part that almost no one is discussing openly, which is the scenario branching that follows from this event. There are 3 distinct pathways forward, and each one reshapes the strategic environment in a different way. In the first scenario, the rescuing power treats this as a one-time demonstration and pulls back its reconnaissance operations in this particular zone to avoid further escalation. That scenario preserves the status quo, but signals that air defense systems can impose costs that alter mission planning. In the second scenario, the rescuing power doubles down and increases the frequency and depth of reconnaissance flights to demonstrate that the shoot-down has not deterred operations. That scenario escalates the confrontation and forces the defending power to choose between accepting the intrusions or shooting down more aircraft. And in the third scenario, the defending power responds to the rescue by deploying more advanced air defense systems, by authorizing more aggressive rules of engagement for proxy forces, or by conducting its own cross-border operation in a different theater to demonstrate that it too can violate sovereignty when strategic interests are at stake. That third scenario is the most dangerous because it transforms a localized incident into a pattern of reciprocal escalation where each side is testing the other's tolerance for risk. The evidence suggests we are already moving toward the third scenario. In the 48 hours since the rescue, 2 developments have occurred that are not coincidental. First, the defending power announced a joint military exercise with its regional ally in a zone that borders the rescuing power's sphere of influence. The exercise involves air defense drills, coastal defense simulations, and electronic warfare training. The message is clear. If you can demonstrate your capability in our backyard, we can demonstrate ours in yours. Second, intelligence reporting indicates that advanced surface-to-air missile systems are being repositioned along the border zones where reconnaissance flights are most frequent. Those systems are not being deployed to shoot down every aircraft. They are being deployed to create cost-benefit calculations that make each reconnaissance mission a potential flashpoint. What we are seeing is the militarization of intelligence competition. And what that means is that the risk of unintended escalation is rising with every flight, every incursion, and every demonstration of capability. Let me bring this to the final and most important layer, which is what this event reveals about the fragility of the current international order. We are living through a period where the rules that governed great power competition for 70 years are being rewritten through actions rather than agreements. The norms that prevented direct military confrontation during the Cold War, limited proxy conflicts during the unipolar moment, and maintained diplomatic channels even during crises are being eroded not through formal rejection, but through operational drift. Each side believes it is responding proportionally to the other's provocations. Each side believes it is defending its legitimate security interests. And each side believes that the other is the one escalating. That mutual belief system creates a dynamic where restraint is seen as weakness, demonstration is seen as necessary, and escalation is seen as defensive. And that dynamic is exactly how wars begin that no one intended to fight. The rescue of this pilot is being celebrated as a success, and on its own terms, it was. But the deeper truth is that the success was purchased at the cost of normalizing actions that make the next crisis more likely, more severe, and harder to contain. History will not remember this as the story of one man being brought home. History will remember this as one of the markers on the road to a conflict that could have been avoided if we had been willing to see the pattern before it became irreversible. If this analysis challenged your assumptions about what modern military competition actually looks like, or made you rethink the strategic stakes behind a single rescue mission, I encourage you to subscribe for ongoing breakdowns that refuse to accept the surface narrative. Because the gap between what we are told is happening and what is actually happening is widening every week. And understanding that gap is the only way to grasp where we are heading. Now, I want to ask you this. Which of the three scenarios do you believe is most likely in the next 6 months? Will we see tactical de-escalation and a return to status quo reconnaissance patterns? Will we see intensified operations and a doubling down on both sides? Or will we see reciprocal escalation in a different theater as the defending power demonstrates its own willingness to cross red lines? Drop your answer in the comments, because the debate over how deterrence collapses is one of the most important conversations we are not having publicly. And in the next video, we are going to examine the economic infrastructure that makes these kinds of high-risk military operations sustainable, why defense budgets in contested regions have increased by 43% over the last 4 years, and what that spending reveals about which powers are preparing for prolonged confrontation versus which powers are betting on diplomatic resolution. Because the money trail always tells the truth that the official statements try to hide. Until then, stay sharp, stay skeptical, and remember that the stories we celebrate are often the ones we understand least.